Welcome, curious minds, to Congress in Context, your direct pathway to understanding the intricate and, let's be honest, often dramatic world of legislative activity.
Absolutely. It can definitely get dramatic.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a bill that has truly sent ripples across Capitol Hill, igniting some really fierce debate, and yes, even some pretty sharp name-calling.
We're talking about H.R. 1, right? Officially titled the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
That's the one. And as you might guess from that rather, well, optimistic name, it's currently at the very heart of congressional contention.
Exactly. And this isn't just, another piece of legislation floating around. It's massive. It's sweeping.
Yeah, sweeping seems like the right word.
Its supporters are championing it as, like, the essential path forward, a stronger, more prosperous future, they say. But its detractors, they've branded it with much less flattering terms. I've even heard Big Ugly Bill.
Big ugly bill, big ugly betrayal. The contrast is stark.
It really is. So our mission today is to try and cut through all that rhetoric, right? To really dissect the bill's core provisions, unpack the intense political back and forth that's happening, and most importantly, explore what its potential real-world implications could actually be for you, the American people.
To give everyone a comprehensive, balanced, and hopefully truly understandable overview, because this is a critical piece of legislation.
Absolutely. So let's really unpack this thing.
Well, let's dive right in then. H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It certainly lives up to its name in one way. It's incredibly comprehensive. It touches on nearly every facet of American life.
It really does. Taxes, healthcare, energy, defense, immigration. You name it, it's probably in there somewhere.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and you mentioned the names. While its Republican proponents embrace that One Big Beautiful Bill moniker, its Democratic critics are not holding back at all, labeling it the Big Ugly Betrayal or just the Big Ugly Bill. Why such, fundamentally different names for the same piece of legislation?
Well, the reason for such opposing viewpoints really lies in its very nature. H.R. 1 is a reconciliation bill.
Okay, let's unpack that term a bit for folks who might not be familiar. Reconciliation.
Sure. So reconciliation is basically a powerful legislative tool. It's designed to fast-track certain budget-related legislation through Congress. And what makes it so significant, so powerful, is that it allows the bill to pass the Senate with just a simple majority vote.
So bypassing the usual 60-vote threshold needed to overcome a filibuster.
Exactly, which means the majority party can push through its agenda without needing any bipartisan support, really. And that often leads to these highly contentious debates, which is precisely what we're seeing play out right now.
Because it touches everything. Taxes, healthcare, energy, defense, immigration. Like you said, a finger in almost every major policy pie.
Pretty much, yeah.
That explains a wide-ranging impact. And what's fascinating here is how deeply this bill aims to reshape our nation's fiscal landscape. The central debate, it seems, revolves around debt, spending, and its projected economic impact.
Absolutely. That's the core conflict.
From the Democratic perspective, for instance, they're really sounding the alarm bells. They're citing projections from the Congressional Budget Office, CBO.
Right, Congress's nonpartisan scorekeeper.
And the CBO indicates this bill will, quote, explode the debt by $3.3 trillion. That's trillion with a T.
And some critics go even further, suggesting it could actually be closer to $4 trillion over time. They also point to a projected $270 billion increase in the deficit for the very next fiscal year alone. That's immediate impact.
And for Democrats, these aren't just abstract numbers, right? They point to the bill's proposed $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling,
Which is huge.
as basically a clear admission that even the bill's architects anticipate massive future debt.
Yeah, they see that $5 trillion figure as Exhibit A. And they translate this down to the everyday American. Democrats claim this bill will ultimately make you pay more to buy a home, more to buy a car, and even more on, credit card debt, things that hit people directly.
They've gone so far as to label it the death knell of the supposed party of fiscal responsibility, dismissing past Republican claims of fiscal prudence as, and this is a quote, utter hogwash.
Strong words, definitely. They clearly see this as a fundamental betrayal of what they view as core conservative fiscal principles.
It's a really scathing assessment. But how do Republicans counter that? How do they respond?
Well, on the other side, Republicans paint a strikingly different picture, as you'd expect. They argue this bill is precisely what's needed to finally put us on a sound financial footing and actually curb spending.
So the exact opposite claim. How do they justify that, given the CBO numbers?
Their central counterargument hinges on taxes. They say that preventing a $4 trillion tax hike is not the same as deficit spending.
Okay, break that down. What do they mean?
What they mean is that by extending current tax rates, which were set to expire, they argue they're preventing a future tax increase that would otherwise automatically happen. And in their view, preventing a tax hike isn't the same thing as adding to the deficit through new spending. It's about maintaining the status quo, fiscally speaking, from their perspective.
So it's about the baseline you're measuring from.
Exactly. It all comes down to the baseline. And they also lean heavily on historical context. They assert that past tax increases adopted by Congress were, historically, not used to pay down the national debt, but were consistently used to increase spending.
So they're framing this debate less about new spending and more about preventing what they see as, I guess, future government overreach and excessive taxation down the line.
That's the narrative, yes.
Yeah.
It's about preventing a tax burden they believe stifles the economy.
Okay. So when we drill down into who actually pays and who benefits from this bill's tax provisions, that's where the narratives diverge even more sharply.
Absolutely. This is where you see the core philosophical differences.
Republicans claim H.R. 1 overwhelmingly benefits middle-class households and job creators. They say it prevents what they call a $5,000 tax increase for working Americans.
And they emphasize a huge number. $600 billion more of new tax relief for hardworking Americans. That's the headline figure they're using.
How do they break down that $600 billion? Where does that relief actually go, according to them?
They cite several key measures. For example, they point to about $73 billion in inflation tax relief specifically targeted at incomes below $100,000.
Okay, targeted relief.
Right. Then there's around $205 billion in tax relief that benefits the vast majority of taxpayers, they say about 90%, who claim the standard deduction. So broad-based relief there.
That covers a lot of people.
It does. Seniors would supposedly see an additional $93 billion in tax relief through a $6,000 bonus exemption. And significantly, there's a $124 billion investment aimed directly at children of low and middle-income families. That's achieved through making the double child tax credit permanent.
So the core message from the Republican side is that this bill is about putting more money back into the pockets of everyday Americans, stimulating the economy from the ground up, and supporting families directly.
That's the pitch. More money for families, less for the government.
And beyond those broad categories, they're proposing some very unique, specific new deductions too. Things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime.
And even no tax on car loan interest. Those are outlined in specific sections 70201, 70202, 702 of the 3, if you look at the bill text. They're quite specific.
The bill also includes provisions for making certain things permanent, right? Like increased estate and gift tax exemption amounts.
Yes, that's in section 70106. Also, increased alternative minimum tax, AMT exemption amounts in 70107. And it extends the limitation on individual deductions for certain state and local taxes, the SALT cap, that's section 70120, and referenced in Amendment SA 2542 as well.
So quite a package aimed at fundamentally shifting tax policy, reducing burdens on individuals and certain sectors, according to supporters.
That's the Republican framing. Now, Democrats, as you can imagine, completely reframe this entire picture.
Okay, how do they see it?
They argue the bill primarily provides tax cuts for billionaires. That's the phrase you hear over and over. They use terms like billionaire giveaways and claim it disproportionately benefits the ultra-rich and the top 0.1% of people who make more than $2.5 million a year.
And they put a number on that benefit.
They suggest it could give those top earners an extra $250,000 a year. And they contend that, far from helping the average American, it will actually take money out of the pockets of working people.
How so? If Republicans are talking about middle-class relief.
Democrats argue the overall effect, perhaps through future cuts or changes to the tax code structure, means average households earning less than $50,000 could potentially lose $700 a year. So a net negative impact for lower earners in their analysis.
And they take issue with the accounting, the math itself.
Oh, absolutely. They accuse Republicans of engaging in what they call bogus math and outright budget fraud. The main charge is that Republicans aren't properly counting the lost revenue from extending those 2017 tax cuts, particularly the ones benefiting the wealthy.
They called it intellectual and economic fraud, I believe, and even fairy dust.
Those are the exact terms used on the floor, yeah.
Yeah.
Basically arguing it hides the true cost of the bill. And what makes these accusations particularly pointed is that Democrats note some Republican congressmen, like Representative Schweikert and Representative Chip Roy, have apparently used similar criticisms about budget baselines in the past, just maybe aimed differently.
That adds another layer, and Democrats have their own proposals to counter this, right? Like restoring progressive corporate tax rates.
Yes, there's a proposed amendment, SAL, that would restore progressive corporate tax rates, ranging from 20% to 28% for different income brackets. There'll be a direct challenge to the Republican approach of maintaining lower, flat corporate rates.
So it really seems like it's less about the specific numbers themselves and more about whose numbers you choose to count and who you believe ultimately benefits from the whole package.
Precisely. That's the crux of it. H.R. 1 really attempts to redefine the American tax philosophy. You know, Republicans see targeted relief for the middle class and businesses as essential fuel for economic growth and individual freedom.
While Democrats view it as a continuation of policies that disproportionately benefit the wealthy, potentially making wealth inequality worse and definitely increasing the national debt.
It's a fundamental disagreement on whose pockets the government should prioritize, plain and simple.
Okay, from our wallets, let's pivot to our well-being. Healthcare is another major battleground in this bill, and perhaps nowhere are the stakes felt more personally.
Absolutely. Healthcare touches everyone.
You hear stories like Diane from Coventry, Rhode Island. Her 15-year-old daughter relies on Medicaid for life-saving care after a brain bleed and stroke.
Devastating situations where coverage is critical.
Or a Maryland constituent whose son's chemotherapy treatments depend entirely on Medicaid. They called the potential loss of coverage a death sentence.
These are incredibly powerful stories, and they fuel the Democratic concerns. They allege the bill would, quote, cut Medicaid by $930 billion nationwide.
$930 billion. That's a staggering number. And how does that translate down to states?
Well, they say it would mean billions in cuts for Connecticut, for example, potentially removing hundreds of thousands of children and families from Medicaid rolls there. A specific example often cited is Louisiana.
What are they saying about Louisiana?
Critics claim the bill could lead to roughly 250,000 people being kicked off health insurance just in that state, and potentially the closure of 33 rural hospitals, costing providers an estimated $588 million.
Wow. And it's not just hospitals, right? What about long-term care?
That's another huge concern. 2 out of every 3 nursing home beds in America are covered by Medicaid. So Democrats are warning of deteriorating conditions, even widespread closures of nursing homes if these cuts were to go through.
And they argue these cuts would have ripple effects, like increasing costs for everyone else.
Exactly. They argue cuts would inevitably increase the cost of uncompensated care, that's care for people who can't pay, which often pushes people to wait until they need the emergency room, a much more expensive option, sometimes 10 times more expensive than insured preventative care.
And that cost gets shifted somehow.
The argument is yes, it gets shifted. It could cause employer-sponsored healthcare premiums, the insurance many people get through work, to spike badly as hospitals and insurers try to make up the difference.
They also point out that the bill does nothing to renew certain tax credits.
Right. They highlight that H.R. 1 doesn't renew the tax credits Democrats passed to lower your health care costs, referring to provisions in things like the Affordable Care Act or subsequent legislation, which they say are currently saving millions of families thousands of dollars a year on their premiums.
Okay, so that's the Democratic view. Significant cuts, harm to vulnerable populations, potential cost increases for everyone. How do Republicans frame their approach to health care in this bill? They certainly don't call them cuts.
No, they don't. Republicans frame their health care provisions not as cuts, but as necessary reforms to ensure the long-term sustainability of Medicaid. They state that even with these reforms, Medicaid spending is projected to continue to grow by billions of dollars over the next 10 years.
So their argument is that spending still goes up, just not as fast as it would have otherwise.
Exactly. Their line is that only in Washington is a smaller increase in spending considered a cut. They assert that their proposed changes will actually improve, protect, and preserve Medicaid for the most vulnerable Americans by making the program more efficient and sustainable.
And how do they address specific concerns, like those provider taxes you mentioned earlier, or the potential impact on rural hospitals?
Well, on provider taxes, they argue the bill corrects abusive practices by freezing and reducing them. They describe these taxes as a financial gimmick used by states to increase federal spending, basically. States' tax providers get federal matching funds based on that higher spending level and maybe give some money back to the providers, Republicans see this as gaming the system.
And rural hospitals, they're often heavily reliant on Medicaid.
Right. For those worried about rural hospitals, the legislation actually creates a bridge funding system. The idea is to help stabilize rural hospitals during the transition to what Republicans call responsible funding levels. The stated aim is to enhance their long-term financial solvency, not shut them down.
So one side sees a lifeline being cut, the other sees necessary reform and stabilization efforts. Very different perspectives.
Completely different. Diving into the specifics of H.R. 1's healthcare provisions, you find a whole range of adjustments. There's a proposed moratorium on implementing new eligibility and enrollment rules for Medicaid, CHIP, and the Basic Health Program.
What else?
The bill includes measures aimed at reducing duplicate enrollment across these different programs, and provisions to make sure deceased individuals and providers are removed from enrollment lists promptly. It also features a payment reduction for certain types of erroneous excess payments under Medicaid and mandates regular eligibility redeterminations for recipients.
What about work requirements? That's often a point of contention with safety net programs.
Yes, that's in here too. What's particularly notable are the sections that would require states to establish Medicaid community engagement, which generally means work requirements for certain individuals.
When would those take effect?
They're slated to become effective by December 31st, 2026, although the bill does include provisions for short-term hardship exceptions.
And are there other restrictions on services or providers?
Yes. The bill explicitly prohibits federal Medicaid payments for specified gender transition procedures. It also excludes certain entities primarily engaged in family planning and reproductive health services. Think organizations like Planned Parenthood, though they aren't always named directly from receiving federal Medicaid payments.
But there are also provisions aimed at improving access in some areas, like rural health.
Correct. On a different note, the bill does establish a rural health transformation program. This would provide grants to states starting July 1st, 2026, specifically to improve access to care in rural areas. It also allows for the approval of waivers to expand coverage for home or community-based services, though that wouldn't begin until July 1st, 2028.
And Democrats have proposed amendments to counter some of these changes.
Yes, definitely. We've seen proposed Democratic amendments aiming to counter some of these changes. For instance, trying to extend those enhanced premium tax credits we mentioned, the ones designed to lower healthcare costs under the ACA. Seeking to establish cost-sharing requirements for insulin products to make insulin more affordable. There was even a proposed amendment for broader dental and oral health services coverage. These amendments really highlight the areas where Democrats believe the bill falls significantly short in supporting healthcare access and affordability for everyday people.
Okay, from healthcare, let's talk about food assistance. Specifically, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNA, what many people still call food stamps.
Another really critical program for millions of Americans.
And another area where Democrats are raising major alarms. They claim the bill cuts $200 billion from the SNOP program.
That's a huge figure for a program like SNL.
And they warn this will lead directly to less food on the table and more children going to bed hungry. They often highlight a stark statistic that 1 in 5 children in the wealthiest nation on the planet are already food insecure, making these potential cuts, in their view, particularly devastating and, frankly, immoral.
Beyond the direct impact on hunger and food security, Democrats also argue these cuts would harm businesses and lead to job losses, particularly in rural America.
How so? How does cutting SNP hurt businesses?
Well, they point to independent grocery stores, which often operate on very thin margins, especially in rural areas. SNAP dollars spent there are crucial revenue. If that revenue disappears, some stores might not survive. And they emphasize the negative impacts on farmers, too. Farmers are already facing headwinds like past tariffs, they argue, and cutting $200 billion from SMP is effectively cutting demand for the food produced by American farmers.
So it's an economic argument as well as a humanitarian one?
Absolutely. They see it as damaging the entire food supply chain and the rural economy.
How do Republicans defend these proposed changes to a program that so many people rely on?
Republicans, on the other hand, defend the SNAP changes primarily by emphasizing what they see as common-sense work requirements. They argue that a work requirement for able-bodied adults just makes sense for SNAP.
What's the core of that argument?
They basically question why taxpayers should subsidize somebody who is capable of working and contributing to their own livelihood and the economy. It's framed as promoting self-sufficiency and responsible use of taxpayer dollars.
And they often draw parallel to past legislation, don't they?
Yes, they frequently draw a parallel to what they consider a remarkably successful bipartisan model, the Welfare Reform Act of 1996.
Which introduced work requirements for TNF, temporary assistance for needy families.
Exactly. That historical precedent is really central to their argument. They see it as proof that such requirements encourage self-sufficiency, reduce dependence on government assistance, and ultimately empower individuals. They believe it's a proven path.
Looking at the specific SNP provisions in H.R. 1, what do they actually do?
Well, they involve reevaluating the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the basis for calculating the uniform benefit allotments.
Yeah.
The bill allows for reevaluation of the market baskets used for this, but not earlier than October 2027.
And the work requirements.
It specifically modifies SNP work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents. That's Section 10102. Additionally, it reduces the federal share of state administrative costs for running the SNAP program, cutting it from 50% down to 25% starting in fiscal year 2027.
That seems like a significant shift in cost sharing between federal and state governments.
It is. And the bill also includes provisions related to SNAP eligibility for non-citizens, specifically referred to as aliens in the text under Section 10108. Overall, it suggests a push for greater fiscal discipline from the Republican perspective and a definite shift in the program's foundational assumptions about work and benefit levels.
Okay, shifting now to education. Student loans are another area where the bill proposes some significant changes, and these are drawing sharp criticism from Democrats.
Yes, higher education funding and student debt are always hot topics.
Democrats allege the bill tears away programs and protections for higher education. Specifically, they say it eliminates grad PLOS loans entirely and cuts families off from parent PLOS loans.
Right. And for those listening, PLUS loans are federal loans that graduate or professional students, and also parents of dependent undergraduate students, can use to help pay for education expenses beyond other aid. They often cover the gap.
So cutting those could significantly limit access to higher education for many families, or at least make it much more expensive.
That's the concern, yes. It could potentially put certain degrees or certain schools out of reach for students who rely on these loans.
Democrats also argue it punishes students who go into public service or a medical residency. How would it do that?
The concern there is that the bill might alter repayment plans, like income-driven repayment or public service loan forgiveness programs, in ways that disadvantage borrowers pursuing those often lower-paying but critical career paths.
They also criticized the bill for, quote, tearing down the guardrails from gutting regulations that protect students whose universities commit fraud. What regulations are they referring to?
That likely refers to the borrower defense to repayment rules. These are regulations designed to offer relief, like loan discharge, to students who were defrauded or misled by their institutions, often for-profit colleges. Democrats worry the bill weakens these protections.
And adding to their concerns, they warn about Pell Grants.
Yes, they warn of opening up a Pandora's box for Pell Grants with a new loophole that would let low-quality programs suck up our taxpayer dollars. Pell Grants are crucial financial aid for low-income students, and the fear is the bill might allow funds to flow to programs that don't deliver real value or job prospects, potentially harming both students and taxpayers.
Okay, so those are the criticisms. Looking at the specifics in the bill text itself, what changes does it actually make to student loans?
Well, it does impose new aggregate loan limits for federal direct PLUS loans, and these would start on July 1st, 2026. It sets a limit of $65,000 for parent PLUS loans taken out for dependent students.
And for other student loans?
For other student loans, including those taken out by grad students themselves, the aggregate limit would be $257,500. It also modifies the repayment options available for federal direct PLUS loans, introducing standard repayment plans based on the loan amount and also income-based repayment plans.
What about those borrower defense regulations?
The bill actually restores the borrower defense to repayment regulations to the way they were back on July 1st, 2020, but only for loans originating before July 1st, 2035. It also delays the implementation of certain closed school discharge regulations that were set to take effect more recently. So it's kind of rolling back some recent regulatory changes in that area.
But it also introduces something new related to workforce training.
Yes, that's quite interesting. It introduces new workforce Pell Grants. These are specifically designed for short-term, high-quality programs that lead directly to a recognized post-secondary credential or an apprenticeship.
So Pell Grants not just for traditional degrees, but for job training.
Exactly. But these programs would be subject to state and federal approval, and they'd have to demonstrate alignment with high-skill, high-wage, in-demand sectors and meet specific earnings outcome thresholds for their graduates. The aim is clearly to support vocational training that's directly tied to current job market needs.
That's a significant shift. Anything else on the education finance side?
A few other things. The bill treats certain post-secondary credentialing expenses as qualified higher education expenses for 529 savings accounts. That makes it easier to save for these types of shorter-term programs using those tax-advantaged accounts.
And changes related to universities themselves.
Yes, it modifies the excise tax on the investment income of certain wealthy private colleges and universities. It sets up different tax rates based on their adjusted endowment per student tiers for 500K, 750K, 750K, $2, and over $2 per student. It also expands the tax on excess compensation paid by tax-exempt organizations, which could hit high salaries at some universities and nonprofits.
And finally, a limit on the Secretary of Education.
Right. It puts a cap, essentially. It limits the Secretary of Education from issuing regulations or taking executive actions that would increase the net cost, the subsidy cost, of federal student loan programs by more than $100 million without congressional approval. That suggests a move to curb future executive actions that might expand student aid significantly.
Okay, let's shift gears now to our planet and its resources. The energy and environment sections of H.R. 1 seem to represent a really significant policy redirection.
Oh, absolutely. This is a major area of focus in the bill, and it's where you see a very clear Republican agenda, often termed America First Energy.
And a big part of that seems to be rolling back initiatives from the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Precisely. The bill specifically rescinds unobligated balances money that was appropriated but hasn't been spent yet from the IRA. And these rescissions target environmental programs directly, things like the funding for Environmental Product Declaration Assistance and the Methane Emissions and Waste Reduction Incentive Program.
It also takes back money allocated to federal agencies.
Yes. It rescinds National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management funds that were part of that IRA package. So it's actively clawing back funding intended for environmental protection and climate initiatives.
And beyond just rescinding funds, the bill seems to actively promote fossil fuel production.
Very actively. It requires the immediate resumption of quarterly onshore oil and gas lease sales on federal lands. It mandates at least 5 lease sales in the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, the NPRA, within the next 10 years, and each sale has to offer 4 million acres. That's a huge amount of land.
What about offshore?
For offshore production, it requires no fewer than 6 oil and gas lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico region between 2026 and 2032. The bill also changes how oil and gas royalties are distributed, specifically giving Alaska a larger share over time. And it makes available at least 4 million additional acres, specifically for coal leasing on federal land.
Plus funding for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Right, it appropriates $400 million, specifically for the SPR. It's a very clear, unmistakable push towards expanding traditional energy sources and domestic fossil fuel production.
It doesn't stop at fossil fuels either. What about forestry?
No, it touches on forestry too. The bill mandates that annual timber sales on public lands have to increase by 20 million board feet each year from 2026 through 2034.
So across the board, a focus on resource extraction and traditional energy. How are Democrats reacting to this?
With alarm, to put it mildly. They are sounding the alarm very loudly, calling these energy provisions a clean energy bloodbath.
A bloodbath. Strong language. What are their specific predictions?
They claim the bill will kill 900,000 good-paying jobs in clean energy, and they predict it will cause your utility bills to hike, specifically saying you could pay 10% more on your electric bills, which would directly impact household budgets across the country.
They see it as economically damaging then.
Absolutely. They describe the bill as nothing short of economic self-sabotage, and even, quote, a total surrender to China on clean energy manufacturing. They argue it risks America's competitiveness in a huge global market and could even risk plunging us into an energy crisis.
How could it lead to an energy crisis?
Democrats claim it will lead to energy shortages. They put a number on it, 500 gigawatts less energy in the next decade. And what's striking is they say that amount is precisely what's needed to meet rising demand, particularly demand driven by energy-intensive AI data centers. So they're painting a picture of a looming supply and demand crisis made worse by this bill slowing down clean energy deployment.
And they attribute motivations beyond just policy preference.
Yes, for Democrats, this isn't just about differing views on energy policy. They allege the bill is essentially a payback to big special interests and billionaires who provide the dark money funding that flows the Republican Party. They argue it enables the fossil fuel industry to make a fortune, while consumers like you will pay the price through higher bills and environmental costs.
And they contrast this sharply with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Very sharply. They highlight the IRA, which they say successfully created over 2,000 new clean energy manufacturing facilities, spurred nearly 1 million jobs. 980,000 is the figure they use, and has provided significant household energy savings, estimated between $460 and $1,000 annually per household. So they see the proposed changes in H.R. 1 as a fundamental and damaging reversal of that clean energy transition strategy.
Looking at the specific energy-related tax provisions in H.R. 1, what do they actually do?
The bill explicitly terminates or restricts various clean energy tax credits. This includes credits for zero-emission nuclear power production, clean hydrogen production, clean electricity production and investment, and advanced manufacturing production. It also restricts the extension of the Advanced Energy Project Credit Program, basically hitting the brakes on many key incentives for green energy.
Are there restrictions related to foreign entities?
Yes, the bill imposes restrictions on who can claim applicable energy credits. It targets specified foreign entities and foreign-influenced entities, which could potentially limit international investment or participation in the U.S. clean energy market.
But it does seem to encourage investment in some other energy areas.
Interestingly, yes. It adds carbon capture, advanced nuclear, hydropower, and geothermal energy to the list of qualifying income sources for publicly traded partnerships, or MLPs. This could potentially encourage more investment in those specific technologies, even as it pulls back on others like wind and solar.
Okay. Beyond the economic and environmental aspects, H.R. 1 also makes significant investments and changes in defense, homeland security, and infrastructure. Let's touch on defense first.
Sure. In defense, the bill proposes substantial funding aimed at improving the quality of life for military personnel. This includes millions specifically for military spouse professional licensure assistance, funds for the Armed Forces Retirement Home facilities, the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, and modernizing staffing at military child care centers. There's also money for DARPA research into casualty care.
What about hardware and capabilities? That's usually a big part of defense bills.
Oh yes, big investments there. Notably, $4.6 billion is earmarked for a second Virginia-class submarine in fiscal year 2026, and another $5.4 billion for 2 additional guided missile destroyer DDG ships.
That's significant shipbuilding investment. What about air power?
There's additional funding dedicated to accelerating the next-generation FXX aircraft development, boosting advanced aerial sensors, making improvements to V-22 Osprey nacelles, speeding up MQ-25 tanker drone acquisition, developing Marine Corps unmanned combat aircraft, and procuring things like conformal fuel tanks for F-15EX fighters.
And strategic capabilities, things like cyber and hypersonics.
Yep. Funding for offensive cyber operations, $1 billion there, $500 million for Indo-Pacific command personnel and operations, money for mesh network communications, $400 million for hypersonic strike programs, and funding for Army air and missile defense interceptors. It's a clear push for enhanced readiness and technological superiority across all the military branches. Modernization is also a focus, with funds for depot and shipyard maintenance, Air Force facilities, and robotic combat vehicle prototyping.
Okay, shifting to homeland security and the border, what's in the bill there?
Several key provisions. It appropriates significant funds specifically for border infrastructure and wall system. There's also money for U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel, more fleet vehicles, and facilities upgrades.
What about detention and enforcement?
It allocates a very large sum, over $42 billion, specifically for detention capacity. It also funds expedited removal processes for non-citizens convicted of certain crimes, criminal aliens in the bill's language, and those determined to have no further legal basis to remain. Additionally, it includes funding for conducting criminal and gang background checks for unaccompanied minors who are 12 years of age or older when encountered.
The bill also introduces new fees and bonuses.
Yes, it institutes a fee for filing appeals from Department of Homeland Security, DHS decisions. That fee starts at $1,000 in fiscal year 2025 and will be adjusted for inflation later. It also authorizes performance and retention bonuses specifically for immigration and customs enforcement, ICE agents, officers, and attorneys, likely aiming to boost morale and retention in those roles.
Is there support for state and local governments?
There is. It establishes something called the State Border Security Reinforcement Fund. This fund would provide grants to eligible states and local governments, specifically for border security purposes, allowing them to supplement federal efforts.
And support for community security.
Yes, importantly, for communities across the country, not just at the border, it allocates over $2.2 billion for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. This program helps protect places like synagogues, mosques, churches, community centers, and other nonprofits from potential threats.
Okay, beyond defense and homeland security, there are various other infrastructure and miscellaneous appropriations tucked into this huge bill.
That's right. For the Coast Guard, it appropriates over $24 billion for mission readiness, operations, and acquisition.
What about space exploration?
Space gets some attention too. It details special appropriations for NASA missions. Billions for Mars sample return and future Mars missions. Significant funding for the Artemis program that includes the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion crew capsule, which are key to returning humans to the moon and eventually going to Mars. It also treats spaceports more like airports under exempt facility bond rules, which could potentially encourage private investment in commercial space launch infrastructure.
Any other notable funding items?
A few others. The bill increases the annual payment that the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority has to make to the U.S. Treasury, jumping from $3 million to $15 million, starting in 2027. It also appropriates over $250 million for capital repair, restoration, maintenance, and security, specifically for the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in D.C.
Looking ahead to a big anniversary.
Yes, it appropriates $150 million for events, celebrations, and activities surrounding the upcoming 250th anniversary of the United States in 2026. And finally, for the Bureau of Prisons, it appropriates $5 billion spread over fiscal years 2025 to 2029, with a specific requirement that at least $3 billion of that must go towards salaries, benefits, and hiring and training new employees, likely addressing staffing shortages.
Let's turn our attention now to agriculture and rural America, which also sees significant specific provisions in this bill. We touched on SNIP earlier, but what about farm programs?
Yes, Title I of the bill details changes to key farm safety net programs, things like price loss coverage, PLC, and dairy margin coverage, DMC. For DMC, it actually increases the payment limit significantly, up to $6 million, and extends the program through 2031. There are also updates to the sugar program, extending existing loan rates out to 2031 as well. These directly impact farmer incomes and planting decisions.
What about crop insurance? That's critical for managing risk.
Crop insurance sees some adjustments. The bill includes provisions aimed at benefiting beginning farmers and ranchers, making it easier for them to participate. It also includes changes related to area-based insurance plans. And quite specifically, it proposes a new poultry insurance pilot program to be conducted in the top poultry-producing states, addressing a gap in current coverage.
And disaster assistance. Farmers always face weather and other unpredictable events.
Right. There's supplemental agricultural disaster assistance included. Notably, it provides assistance for death losses of unborn livestock, which is a specific issue, and also covers losses due to bird depredation, specifically for farm-raised fish producers.
What about conservation and research funding in agriculture?
The bill mentions funding for several areas there. Things like plant pest and disease management programs, specialty crop block grants, which help fruit and vegetable growers, the National Organic Certification Cost Share Program to help farmers transition to organic, and funding for a multiple crop and pesticide use survey. So there are elements attempting to balance production support with resource management and agricultural research needs.
Now, beyond these major categories, taxes, healthcare, energy, Ag HR 1 includes a really fascinating array of other notable provisions. It truly underscores how comprehensive this thing is.
It really does. It reaches into so many different corners of policy.
For instance, opportunity zones. What does the bill do there?
It permanently renews and actually enhances the Opportunity Zones program. These are those designated low-income communities where investors can get tax benefits for investing capital gains. The bill introduces specific rules for something called Qualified Rural Opportunity Funds, aiming to better direct investment into rural areas, and it adds new reporting requirements to track the program's effectiveness.
What about affordable housing?
In housing, the bill permanently enhances the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, LIHTC, which is a really critical tool for financing affordable rental housing development. It also extends the New Markets Tax Credit, NMTC, another program designed to incentivize private investment in businesses and economic development projects located in low-income communities.
And charitable giving. You mentioned the standard deduction increase earlier, which might affect itemized deductions.
Right. To address that, The bill provides for the permanent and expanded reinstatement of a partial deduction for charitable contributions, specifically for individuals who do not itemize their deductions. This makes it easier for more people, not just higher earners who itemize, to get a tax benefit from their charitable giving.
What about the entertainment industry? Film, TV, music?
They get a nod too. The bill allows for full expensing, meaning deducting the full cost immediately for qualified film, television, live theatrical, and even sound recording productions. There's a $150,000 limit specifically for sound recordings, but it's generally aimed at boosting production within these creative sectors.
A very specific change relates to firearms taxes.
Yes, quite specific. It reduces the federal transfer tax on certain firearms, specifically those regulated under the National Firearms Act, but not classified as machine guns or destructive devices, down to $0. It keeps the existing $200 transfer tax in place for machine guns and destructive devices like bombs or grenades.
And in a very modern twist, artificial intelligence.
Right. The bill actually includes provisions related to AI. It provides definitions for artificial intelligence and AI model. And it states that federal funds provided through the bill may be conditioned on things like temporary pauses in AI development and achieving certain efficiencies. Importantly, it also includes language saying that states may not regulate AI more restrictively than other comparable systems, suggesting a move towards a federal framework or at least preventing a patchwork of state AI regulations.
And perhaps one of the most uniquely named provisions, the Trump accounts.
Yes, that one definitely catches the eye. It establishes a Trump accounts and contribution pilot program. This creates a new type of savings account specifically for individuals under the age of 18.
How would these accounts work?
There are specific rules about eligible investments, mostly mutual funds or ETFs, that track certain qualified stock indexes. It also includes provisions allowing for employer contributions to these accounts and penalties if people make improper claims related to them. It seems like a novel approach aimed at encouraging youth savings and investment, particularly in the stock market.
And finally, tariffs. There was mention of an executive order.
Yes, there are proposed amendments related to Executive Order 14257, which deals with imposing reciprocal tariffs to try and rectify trade deficits. These amendments, like SAL and SA 2574, aim to terminate those duties or exempt certain food items from them, potentially easing the impact of those specific tariffs.
Okay, we've covered a ton of ground on the what of the bill. Let's transition now to the political dynamics on the floor of Congress. This has been, as we said, nothing short of heated.
Heated is an understatement. The clash of narratives is really palpable.
Republicans, for instance, claim that any opposition to the bill is essentially, quote, all propaganda from the other side. They argue it's designed purely to confuse Americans and energize the Democratic base.
Right. One Republican explicitly said on the floor, "If you are an American watching, I see why you are confused, because it's all propaganda from the other side." They're really trying to frame the Democratic opposition as manufactured, not based on the actual merits or flaws of the bill itself.
But Democrats fire back just as strongly, asserting that Republicans are trying to pull a fast one on the American people. They suggest there's a hidden agenda, or at least a rush to pass a massive bill without proper scrutiny or understanding of its consequences.
And the debate also reveals some interesting shifts, or claimed shifts, in party identity. You hear Republicans acknowledging, almost embracing, being a new party now, one focused more intently on the working class.
Admitting past mistakes, even.
Yeah, one said, "It was a mistake that we weren't thinking about the working class and the way we are today." That's a significant rhetorical shift, clearly aimed at broadening their appeal beyond traditional bases.
Conversely, Democrats characterize the modern Republican Party as being driven by, quote, radicals in the House and Senate. And interestingly, they also lament their own party sometimes being, in their view, unfairly associated with fringe elements, mentioning an anti-Semitic socialist winning that nomination in New York as an example of the complexities and frustrations within their own coalition.
And what's also crystal clear is the immediate blame game each side employs to explain current problems or potential future harms.
How so? Give us an example.
Well, Republicans, for instance, you hear them blaming 10 million illegals, their number, for driving down wages and raising housing costs. They argue this directly impacts working Americans, not just the ultra-rich, connecting immigration to economic pressures felt by their base.
While Democrats do the opposite, laying blame elsewhere.
Exactly. Democrats lay the blame for the increasing national debt and the rising cost of living squarely on the billionaire giveaways they see within this bill. They argue that tax cuts for the wealthy eventually hit everyone's pocketbook, either through increased national debt that needs servicing or through future cuts to services that benefit everyone.
We've certainly heard strong voices from the floor articulating these points. A Republican speaker expressed immense confidence in the bill's benefits for, quote, 31 million people in my state and the 250 million people who call America home.
And they even issued a direct challenge, didn't they?
Yes, a direct challenge to the media and Democrats to come out here on the floor and go line by line in what I just said and tell me what I just said is not true, really asserting the factual basis of their claims about the bill's positive impacts.
On the other side, the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, has expressed particularly strong and vocal opposition. He characterized the bill as a trap for the American people, and interestingly, even a trap for Republican members themselves.
How so? A trap for Republicans.
He emphasized warnings that passing this bill will ultimately doom their own communities and doom their political fortunes. He's directly challenging their political calculus, suggesting a vote for this bill would become a major political liability for them back home.
Other senators have also weighed in quite forcefully. Senator Cantwell urged colleagues to reject the bill, emphasizing the need for fiscal policy that truly grows the economy and benefits all Americans, not just certain groups.
Senator Durbin reflected on the historical context of the Senate, suggesting this debate echoes past fundamental legislative battles over the direction of the country. Senator Baldwin focused specifically on the bill's impact on her constituents in Wisconsin, stating it jeopardizes health care for nearly 260,000 residents there.
Senator Lujan had some strong words, too.
He did. He declared the bill does not pass the smell test and argued it is not honest, it is not caring, and it is not fair, really framing his opposition in moral terms. And Senator Wyden specifically called out the healthcare carnage and the clean energy bloodbath that he believes Republicans are dragging America toward, painting a very vivid negative picture of the potential consequences.
The procedural battles themselves often become a form of political theater in these situations, don't they?
Absolutely. Democrats, for instance, have threatened a night of votorama, specifically to expose this bill piece by piece.
Can you remind listeners what exactly a votorama is?
Sure. A votorama is a procedural tactic unique to the Senate, used during budget reconciliation processes like this one. It allows senators to introduce essentially an unlimited number of amendments to the bill. The majority then has to hold votes on each one, often forcing votes late into the night or even over multiple days.
And the purpose is?
It serves multiple purposes for the minority party. It can highlight provisions they find particularly objectionable, force members of the majority party to take potentially difficult or unpopular votes on the record, or simply delay the proceedings and try to exhaust the opposition. It's political theater, but with real procedural weight.
We also saw some significant parliamentary inquiries happening on the floor, like Senator Merkley's query about the current law baseline for budgeting. Why is that baseline issue so important?
It's crucial because the baseline is the starting point for all budget calculations. It's supposed to be a projection of future spending and revenue if current laws remain unchanged. Critics, particularly Democrats in this case, accuse Republicans of manipulating this baseline, calling it fake math or budget fraud, to make the bill's costs appear lower than they really are, or to make its claimed benefits like tax cuts seem larger.
So it's about the assumptions baked into the numbers.
Exactly. It's about whether the starting point for the calculation is realistic or if it's been, let's say, massaged to produce a desired outcome. The Democratic leader jumped in on this, arguing that while the baseline has historically been changed by Budget Committee chairmen sometimes, he claimed this instance was different, perhaps implying it was done specifically to hide the true costs of the bill.
Democrats also expressed deep concerns about Republicans potentially trying to, quote, blow up the Senate rules by overriding the Senate parliamentarian.
Yes, that's a huge procedural deal. The parliamentarian is the nonpartisan arbiter of Senate rules, including the strict rules governing what can and cannot be included in a reconciliation bill under the Byrd Rule. Democrats worried Republicans might try to ignore or overrule the parliamentarian's advice if certain provisions were deemed ineligible for reconciliation.
And they drew a parallel to a past event?
They did, drawing a parallel to a past instance involving the repeal of California's Clean Air Act standards via reconciliation, which was highly controversial. They even quoted a Republican senator who reportedly called such an action overriding the parliamentarian killing the filibuster by another means because it undermines the rules that protect the minority. This highlights just how intense and high stakes the procedural maneuvering can become.
Amidst all this intense partisan conflict, were there any rare bipartisan notes, anything both sides could agree on?
Very few, but a couple. The Welfare Reform Act of 1996 is frequently mentioned, mostly by Republicans, but is a bipartisan bill at the time. They cite it as a historical example of bipartisan agreement on the principle of work requirements, even though its application to SNAP-P today is obviously highly debated.
So, referencing a past bipartisan achievement, even if the current context is different.
Right. It's an attempt to ground their current proposal in a moment of past cross-party consensus.
Anything else?
And in a truly rare moment of unity, you actually heard leaders from both sides express genuine appreciation for the nonpartisan cloakrooms, the staff who manage floor operations for each party, and the general floor staff for their hard work and dedication during these long, grueling sessions.
It's a small thing, perhaps, but a notable acknowledgement.
It is. It's a brief reminder that beneath all the political battles, there's a professional staff, dedicated people from both sides, working together just to make the basic machinery of the Senate function, even during the most contentious debates.
Okay, let's try to put all of this into a broader context now and provide a deeper understanding of this congressional action and what it really means for you, the listener. At its core, as you said, H.R. 1 is a reconciliation bill, that legislative fast track.
Right. And the timing itself became part of the debate. The Democratic leader pointed out that Republicans scrambled to meet an entirely arbitrary deadline for getting this bill ready, suggesting the push was driven more by political calendar considerations than by, say, policy readiness or careful deliberation.
And central to this whole debate, as we've discussed, is that highly contested element of budgetary baselines and the role of the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office.
Absolutely crucial. Because, again, that baseline, the projection of future spending and revenue if current laws stay the same, is the foundation. And the accusation from critics is that this foundation was deliberately manipulated, using terms like fake math or budget fraud to argue that the bill's costs were artificially lowered or its benefits exaggerated.
So the CBO's official scoring, its estimate of the bill's cost, becomes this huge focal point. But even that scoring depends on the baseline assumptions given to the CBO.
Precisely. The CBO scores based on the instructions and baselines provided by Congress, usually the budget committees. So the scoring itself can become contested if the underlying assumptions are seen as flawed or politically motivated. The disagreement isn't just on the policy itself, it's often on the very accounting methods used to evaluate it.
Procedural tools also play a really significant role in these high-stakes legislative battles. You mentioned motions to commit earlier.
Right. Motions to commit are a key tool for the minority party, or even dissenting members within the majority. They allow members to propose sending the bill back to committee with specific instructions, essentially, to amend it in a certain way.
Even if they know the motion will likely fail?
Often, yes. Because forcing a vote on that motion achieves other goals. It forces members to go on the record on specific, often controversial issues like specific health care cuts or certain tax provisions or maybe tariffs. It can highlight differences between the parties, expose provisions the minority finds problematic, and create fodder for future political campaigns. It's a way to shape the narrative even if you can't change the outcome.
Okay, so let's connect all this complex legislative and procedural wrangling back to the listener. What does it all mean for you, potentially impacting your life directly? Let's talk about those real-world implications, starting with healthcare access and quality.
This is where the potential impacts are perhaps most immediate and personal. If enacted as written, the bill could have significant consequences, particularly for rural hospitals and nursing homes.
Many of which are already struggling financially, right? And heavily dependent on Medicaid funding.
Exactly. They often operate on very thin margins. We heard that stark example from Decatur, Illinois, where a hospital, facing financial crunch time even before this bill, had to eliminate its OB/GYN services and mental health services just to try and stay open. That illustrates the kind of tough choices and service cuts that critics fear could become much more widespread if Medicaid funding is significantly reduced.
And these cuts could lead to cost shifts across the entire healthcare system. You mentioned that earlier.
Yes, that's a major concern. If millions of people lose Medicaid coverage, the cost of uncompensated care the care hospitals provide but don't get paid for will inevitably increase. And that cost has to go somewhere.
Where does it go?
The argument is that it often gets passed on indirectly to those with private employer-sponsored insurance. Hospitals may negotiate higher rates with private insurers to cover their losses, which then translates into higher premiums for businesses and workers. So paradoxically, cutting Medicaid could end up making healthcare more expensive for people with private insurance.
And we heard those powerful personal stories. Diane's daughter needing life-saving care, the Maryland constituent whose son's cancer treatment depends on Medicaid, calling its potential loss a death sentence.
Those stories really underscore the profound human impact behind the budget numbers and the policy debates. These aren't just abstract adjustments. They represent fundamental decisions about who gets access to necessary, sometimes life-sustaining medical care and who doesn't.
Then there's food security in local economies. The SNAP program, which many people think of as just providing food aid.
Actually plays a much larger and more integrated role in the economy, especially in certain areas.
How so?
Well, economists estimate that every dollar in SNAP benefits distributed actually generates more than $1.50 in economic activity. That money is spent quickly, locally, mostly on groceries. So SNAP doesn't just feed families, it also directly supports local grocery stores, farmers, and the entire food supply chain. It's an economic multiplier.
And the impact of potential SNAP cuts on rural America is a particular concern for opponents.
Yes, very much so. These cuts could directly threaten the viability of independent rural grocery stores. Many operate on those razor-thin margins we talked about, and SNAP purchases can be a significant portion of their revenue. Losing that could force closures, creating food deserts. It also adds another significant headwind, as critics put it, for American farmers who rely on SNAP recipients to buy their produce, dairy, meat, and other products.
So the debate over SNT isn't just about feeding hungry families, although that's obviously critical. It's also about the economic health of entire communities and the agricultural sector that supports them.
Precisely. It's interconnected.
Okay, when it comes to energy costs and innovation, the bill proposes significant changes that could directly affect your utility bills and, more broadly, our nation's energy future.
Yes, the argument from opponents is clear. H.R. 1's energy provisions, by hindering clean energy development and potentially rescinding IRA funds, will lead to energy shortages down the road. And that basic supply and demand imbalance, they argue, will inevitably mean higher utility bills for consumers.
And they pointed to a specific looming demand.
Right. What was really striking was the specific mention that the projected shortfall, 500 gigawatts less energy in the next decade, is roughly the amount analysts estimate is needed just to meet the rising demand, especially from the burgeoning needs of AI data centers, which are incredibly energy intensive. So they're forecasting a potential supply and demand crisis if the transition to clean energy is slowed down by this bill.
This also raises strategic concerns about U.S. competitiveness globally, doesn't it?
It does. Opponents of the bill argue forcefully that ending significant clean energy investments could be a total surrender to China on clean energy manufacturing. China has invested heavily in solar panels, batteries, and other green technologies. The fear is that pulling back now could cede America's future economic standing in these rapidly growing global markets. It becomes a debate not just about domestic energy costs, but about long-term economic leadership and even national security.
And finally, let's bring it back to the debt in your wallet. The argument from critics is pretty straightforward here.
Yes, it's clear. Adding trillions to the national debt, as they claim this bill will do based on the CBO score and their own analysis, will almost inevitably put upward pressure on interest rates. The government will need to borrow more, potentially crowding out private investment and making borrowing more expensive for everyone.
And higher interest rates directly impact the cost of, well, almost everything financed.
Exactly. Mortgages for buying a home, car loans, credit card debt. The cost of borrowing goes up for average Americans. It makes everyday life more expensive regardless of your income level. It's a potential ripple effect that touches nearly every major financial decision you might make.
It's also important, I think, to recognize some of the historical echoes and precedents that keep coming up in this debate.
Definitely. History provides important context.
The 1996 Welfare Reform Act, for example, Republicans frequently cited as a successful bipartisan model for the work requirements they want to implement in SNAP now.
Right. Understanding that historical parallel, a moment when both parties agreed on adding work requirements to cash assistance, helps explain why work requirements remain such a consistent theme in conservative social policy thinking. They invoke that past legislative success, which they see as having reduced dependency and increased employment, to justify applying a similar approach to other programs like SNAP today.
And if we connect this to more recent history, many of the warnings we're hearing today about H.R. 1, about exploding debt leading to future cuts, sound very similar to warnings made during the 2017 tax cut debates.
That's true. Critics back then predicted that the large, unpaid-for tax cuts would balloon the national debt, which would then inevitably force Congress to make cuts to social programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security down the road to try and balance the books.
And supporters of H.R. 1, or at least critics of the current spending levels, might see those past warnings as now materializing. They might say, see, we told you the debt would force these kinds of choices.
Exactly. Some might argue that their previous concerns about the trajectory of the debt, exacerbated by those tax cuts, are now proving prophetic, necessitating the kind of spending reforms or cuts, depending on your perspective, proposed in H.R. 1. It becomes part of a longer narrative about fiscal responsibility.
This also brings the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, into really sharp focus, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The current bill's proposed changes, especially the rollback of clean energy investments and the rescission of funds, stand in stark contrast to the stated goals and, according to Democrats, the early successes of the IRA.
Which they credit with spurring manufacturing, creating jobs.
Right. Democrats point to the IRA boosting domestic manufacturing of things like solar panels and batteries, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, and starting to lower household energy costs. H.R. 1 represents a significant policy reversal in that climate and energy landscape. It could fundamentally alter the pace and direction of the nation's energy transition, moving away from the IRA's focus on accelerating green energy deployment.
So, looking ahead, what does all of this mean for the future? What's actually next for H.R. 1?
Well, road ahead is certainly uncertain, but the next critical juncture will likely be that threatened night of votorama we discussed.
Where countless amendments get proposed and voted on potentially deep into the night.
Exactly. It's likely to stretch for hours, possibly days. It will be a chance for Democrats to try and force votes on specific, potentially unpopular aspects of the bill, essentially trying to expose it piece by piece, as they said. And it forces members to take public stances on a wide range of controversial issues, which can have political consequences later.
This process also really highlights the intense pressure on individual members to maintain party unity, doesn't it?
Tremendous pressure. Supporting or opposing a bill this massive and this partisan puts members in a very high-stakes position. You hear phrases like having to walk the plank under the threat of a primary if they deviate from the party line. The political risks are significant.
And despite the strong predictions we hear from both sides about the bill's impact,
The truth is, the true long-term economic effects of a bill this complex remain, well, anybody's guess after the first year or so. There are just too many variables. The one thing that seems more certain, as some have noted based on early estimates, is that projected $270 billion deficit increase for the very next fiscal year. That would be an immediate impact on our national finances.
looking beyond the immediate fate of H.R. 1, what about the broader policy trends and consequences if this bill or something like it were to become law?
Its passage would undeniably set a new course for federal spending, debt, and revenue. It would likely influence budget debates and fiscal policy choices for years, potentially decades to come. It would fundamentally reshape how the nation approaches its financial responsibilities and priorities.
And the implications for the social safety net seem particularly profound.
Absolutely. Changes to cornerstone programs like Medicaid, SNP, and federal student aid could significantly alter access to basic necessities like healthcare, food, and education for millions of Americans, especially the most vulnerable among us. It could potentially redefine the role and scope of government support in daily life.
On energy, the potential long-term effects on the U.S.'s clean energy goals, our position in the global green technology race, and ultimately consumer energy costs could be substantial.
Yes, it could significantly accelerate or decelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, depending on which provisions ultimately survive. And that has huge implications for our ability to meet climate targets, compete in emerging global industries, and manage energy costs for consumers.
And, of course, the bill's significant border security and immigration enforcement provisions could fundamentally alter U.S. immigration policy and have major impacts on communities across the country, especially those along the border.
That's right. It represents a significant investment in enforcement and infrastructure, potentially leading to major shifts in how migration is managed and how immigrant communities are affected.
Finally, stepping back even further, the intense debate around H.R. 1 really reveals the deep, perhaps deepening partisan divides that exist in Congress today.
It certainly does.
It raises an important, maybe unsettling question about the future of bipartisanship. Given such entrenched positions on such fundamental issues, what does this suggest about the challenges, and maybe the possibilities, for future cross-party cooperation on major legislation?
It's a stark reminder of the ideological chasm that seems to define so much of our current political landscape. Finding common ground on big issues looks incredibly difficult right now.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive, and back to you, the listener. In a democracy, your voice truly matters. Understanding these complex legislative details, we hope, is the first step towards empowering that voice.
Absolutely. And we really encourage you to seek out and explore primary sources for yourself. You can find and read the bills we discussed today. Just look for the bill numbers like H.R. 1 or amendment numbers like SA 2360 on official government websites like congress.gov.
When you look at those documents, maybe check out the summaries first, but also look at the sections detailing changes to existing laws or the specific appropriations language. It helps you see the legislative sausage making, as they say, firsthand.
And please connect with your representatives. Let them know what you think. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have acknowledged they know their offices are getting the same calls on issues like this.
We even heard reports during past contentious debates of congressional phone systems literally breaking down because of the overwhelming volume of people calling and literally begging their elected officials to vote a certain way.
Those personal stories, combined with collective voices reaching out, can genuinely influence decisions and shape policy. It shows lawmakers the tangible impact their votes had on their constituents back home.
And remember, engaging in our democracy goes beyond just casting a ballot every couple of years.
That's right. You can track committee actions and legislative calendars online. You might even attend public hearings if local activities related to the bill's impacts are being discussed in your area. You can support advocacy groups that align with your interests and values. And importantly, engage in civil discourse about these issues with your friends, family, and neighbors.
This debate, as some lawmakers themselves have framed it, is really a fight for our democracy and for the character of the country. Because, as one lawmaker put it, reflecting constituent concerns, ordinary Americans don't want to do this to our children. The stakes feel very high to many people.
They certainly do.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you today. Given the starkly contrasting visions presented for the nation's future within this single comprehensive bill, H.R. 1, what does this deep dive reveal about the fundamental choices you believe Congress is making right now on behalf of the American people? And perhaps more importantly, what responsibility do we each bear in shaping that path forward?